I work a lot on trying to figure out ways to build community-based food systems. And I moved to Duluth actually about 4 years ago. I taught at Arizona State University for about 9 years, and my wife and I decided that we wanted to move back home. We both are from Minnesota, and wanted to raise our kids here as well as help elderly parents and so forth. And so my wife got the position, and I ended up moving with her as a trailing spouse, and then eventually nesting in the university itself too. We both are professors and so forth. But in terms of my broader work around food systems, and more particularly community food systems, I grew up on a small farm in western Minnesota, and am one of the tens of millions of refugees associated with the imposition of the industrial agriculture system and the giganticization of farms that accompanied that process. And so I live with the proclivities of small-scale farming, which I like to joke, you're a master of trade, master of everything, and or rather, jack of all trades and a master of little. But that's really unfair to farmers and stuff to make that joke, because of course farmers are masters of many things, and but the point in that is that you're faced with a lot of unrehearsed situations on farms, and you have to figure out how to get done what needs to get done. And so that handiness comes in handy in many, many instances, but it also, in a sense, empowers me in relation to food issues and agriculture issues, something I've continued in my life as a serious organic gardener for decades, and then more recently, over the last 6-8 years, becoming more involved in the local foods movement, which is to say that rebuilding the capacity of regions to produce more of the food that they eat, and in order to do so, to build the infrastructure to make that possible. And so, as I say, I moved to Duluth, and we moved to Duluth, and I went about rooting myself in Duluth by interviewing perhaps 100 people in the food and agriculture and environmental realms in Duluth, and basically, identifying the most interesting people that my previous interviewee told me about and calling them up for coffee and finding out who they were and what their connections were as a means by which to help me understand the world of Duluth. And so, through that, I came to understand some of the history and present challenges and opportunities as it related to Duluth's sense of identity and its struggles and its aspirations. And within that, of course, there's a robust food movement, regional food movement. And so I figured out ways to, in a sense, plug myself in to that existing framework.
Can you say a little bit about the kind of confrontation with large-scale agriculture in your early history, the farm history?
Yeah, well, I grew up in western Minnesota in Lackaparrow County, which straddles the South Dakota border on that little point that juts out on the western side of Minnesota, and it's the prairies, or as they say in Norwegian, Popradian, and it was populated by Norwegian farmers, and in the 1870s, and it remained a very rural area from that period on all the way through the 1960s. In fact, my father spoke Norwegian as his primary language in spite of, not being from Norway or not his parents being from Norway. But that's how sort of encapsulated in a rural sense that area was. Beginning in the 1960s, a big transition was about to reshape the landscapes and the communities around that area and many other areas around the country during a period of industrialization. And this was really, I think, one of the second great enunciation points in the transition to an industrial agriculture, namely the application of petrochemicals very broadly to the production of food and fiber in America following World War II and the kind of success that petrochemicals had brought the United States in that war, and then the application of all of that technology afterwards. And so what happened is that there was an increasing economy of scale that was taking shape in farms in my region. And so farms that when I was born in the late 50s that were 80 to 160 acres and had been, moving along, if not hugely financially successful, then successful in many other ways in providing people a stable living in a community and so forth, began to change. And the upsizing of farms began to take shape with the demand that larger machinery and greater petrochemical use and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and so forth to be used. But also in my particular area, which was dotted with potholes of wetlands, and it was an amazing area in that it was largely a sink for much of the huge surrounding area, and the water would sort of sit in potholes and sloughs and waterways. And like I say, beginning in the 1960s, that began to change in the sense that drainage ditches and culverts became increasingly the norm. And across the early part of my life, say the first 10 years, I watched the landscape change dramatically from an integrated world of wildlife and humans to one in which humans, in a sense, were at war with the landscape, disciplining it by draining the wetlands, bulldozing the trees, bulldozing hills, all to make flat and possible for ever enlarging machinery and the whole petrochemical industrial process to kind of roll over those lands. And that process has continued, into the present, the latest iteration being genetically modified organisms and Roundup-ready worlds and so forth. But machinery keeps getting larger and so forth and so on. And so, I, like I say, am one of the millions of refugees, as it were, from rural America that found themselves in cities like Minneapolis. But I think I take from that experience a sort of visceral knowledge of the trade-offs that we have made in imposing this control management industrial system, but also not just the trade-offs, but the suffering. Because, in that area, as well as many, many other areas in rural America, you cannot drink the water any longer. Everyone dies of cancer. And the towns are dying. And the costs of those decades of chemicalization are really mounting in terms of, the ecological and human damage that they've caused. And so I bring that that sense of living history into the world that I live in today, not just in my intellectual work, but also in my body, and the body of the rest of my family, who, you know, virtually every one of them have died of some form of cancer. And, you know, there's a kind of grim acceptance of that, you know, in that region, I think. But boy, did we pay a price for you know, for using food as a weapon in the Cold War and going for that industrial system.
Did your academic work reflect your concern with this issue of industrialized agriculture, or did you move away from that and then come back to these matters?
Well, you know, I think I absorbed the messages of the modernizing world, and I ran from agriculture for many decades. You know, there's a real series of overt and subliminal messages that in our culture that you know, rural people are somehow not exactly subhuman, but subcultural perhaps, that farmers are a dying breed and probably good, and that you know, that whole kind of world of working with your hands has been denigrated in our increasingly electronic and hidden world of machineries and virtual systems and so forth. And so, you know, I absorbed all that information and, you know, ended up moving to the cities when I was, to Minneapolis when I was in my, when I was 17, and then, you know, worked in a factory. I sold carpet. I did a whole bunch of different things. And then actually, you know, in my mid-20s, I had a roommate who was going to college, and I marveled at the fact that he could ride his bike on afternoons, you know, which I could only do if I called in sick to the warehouse. And so I began to kind of move towards this idea of going to college. And so in my mid-20s, I started college here at the university, and had no particular plan, but really followed my interests. And they took me into a couple areas, one of which was Scandinavian studies, and I studied in Norway. I lived on farms in Norway and worked on very small farms. But the point was not about agriculture. The point was just language and the new world that living abroad was bringing me. But then I also studied American studies with the great historian David Noble. And David taught me a lot about, you know, the incredible transformation that World War II brought to our U.S. nation, and, you know, the sort of, you know, difficult to underestimate the huge impact that had in terms of redirecting the United States. And so I ended up getting degrees in American studies and Scandinavian studies. And then I wrote journalism for several years for The Circle, an Indian newspaper, an urban native newspaper, and a series of other small publications and so forth. And then, but I was a serious autodidact. I read all the time, and you know, people said, just go to grad school, for God's sake, you know, you'll get to do all that for, you know. And so I ended up applying to several places around the country, but Minnesota came up with a a sort of package for me that if I would study, or rather advise students, you'd get this kind of tuition waiver and a stipend and health insurance. And so I ended up going to do a PhD in American Studies at the University of Minnesota here. A wonderful place, a wonderful degree, great people. I worked closely with Larry May and in particular David Noble, and it was amazing. I learned so much about the world. But what I ended up studying was why and how the marketing of nuclear waste to American Indian communities by the U.S. government and nuclear utility corporations was taking shape. What was behind this seemingly preposterous, destructive idea such that it could be advanced by our federal government? And so I studied that and worked with tribes, wrote lots of educational pieces. I won some awards, and I ended up getting a position after working at Rice University for a while, where my wife had a position. I ended up getting a position in justice studies in Arizona, and my wife then was able to get a position at Arizona State as well, and we moved there, and I continued to teach environmental justice issues, in particular around energy and nuclear waste issues and so forth. But what happened is students voiced their interest in wanting sort of other topics than these kinds of depressing topics that like nuclear waste that lasts forever. And what do we do with it? And so I began to kind of explore sustainability and how to integrate that. And in the meantime, as I said, I was a serious gardener, and I had a double lot, and I changed every square inch of that landscape around three principles: hydrology, aesthetics, and use, and installed citrus grove and deciduous fruit grove and a native area and a wiffle ball field for my three boys and chickens and geese, and had this kind of integrated food production system, a sort of small farm in the suburban Tempe, and began to teach classes, bring my environment justice students to my house to illustrate sort of environmental relationships that we could create in urban contexts around food and so forth that would have multifunctional purposes. It would produce good food. It would help us take care of the landscapes. It would provide habitat for animals. It would provide places for kids to learn, etc. And then I began to work with Arizona State University on thinking about ways that their grounds, which contain huge numbers of fruit trees, could be the fruit of those trees could, instead of being thrown away, could be gathered and brought somewhere. And initially, after a series of processes in which I worked with the grounds people and faculty and students and so forth, we began to deliver all of that fruit to a primate refuge center. And then after that took off a little bit, the administration began to embrace it and provide presents for donors and so forth with this, and it sort of took off. And I became very interested in the challenges of sustainability at institutional levels, in which essentially the task is to take care of your own house. How do you iterate your institution towards greater sustainability, particularly but not limited to food? And so that then brought me back to all of this sort of residual skill sets that I had grown up with on the farm, but also a certain confidence and handiness in terms of approaching the challenges associated with that. And so by the time I relocated to Duluth, that became my primary project rather than kind of working on nuclear waste issues.
And can you say just a little more about what your kind of academic or scholarly project is now? What kind of thing you're working on?
Well, I am working on a number of things, but the primary thing is to explore how the University of Minnesota Duluth can become an anchor institution in that Western Lake Superior region around sustainability and food by changing their own food system, by procuring more local healthy foods, by teaching students more about foods, farming and agriculture, gardening, and by modeling healthy food behaviors. And so what I've done is created something called the Sustainable Agriculture Project at UMD, which is essentially a platform to advance these issues. But what the unique thing that we enjoy is that we have a field site. We have a 10-acre field site and a 5-acre apple orchard, and the 10-acre site is an organic transition farm. And this is all on the ruins of the abandoned Northeast Experimental Station, one of 6 experimental stations in Minnesota, and the only one that was closed because of why? Because of industrialization, because it was deemed in the 60s and 70s that the landscapes of the Northeast would not support the productivity demands and the machinery sizes and the crops of industrialization. And so that region was, in a sense, deemed superfluous to the project of the experimental stations. And it was abandoned, as I say, by the university system. And that land then devolved from control by the St. Paul campus to the Duluth campus. And it essentially sat abandoned for 20, 30, 40 years. And so what we've managed to do is gain stewardship over 15 acres of that land, and again, are using it as a field site for advancing these issues on campus. And so one of the things, for example, that we do is collaborate with the dining services to grow produce that's then used in the dining services at UMD, which has remained a self-operated system, unlike the Twin Cities campus or others that are corporate Aramark or something. And so there's some degree of flexibility in that self-operated system where they can accept this produce and use it as a way for themselves to relearn how to utilize minimally processed food as a step towards procuring greater amounts from area farmers, in turn helping seed a local food system and walking the walk of being an anchor institution for positive change in our region. And so I work with the sustainable, I coordinate that, I founded it, but I also work with a lot of community-based activities around building capacity for local food systems as well.
I gather one of the big problems for building local capacity is just finding a market.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you got to find buyers for quantity and absent somebody to sell to, everything still is going to stay very small. And so universities, colleges, anything that buys in bulk become players.
Right.
So how much luck have you had getting UMD to buy significant quantities of local food?
Well, it's been good. Now, it's not been a linear process, but it's good. The Institute of Advanced Study provided us with a faculty, seminar fund a couple years ago, and instead of using that solely for faculty, we invited key staff from dining services and facilities management and sustainability, as well as some key community people and faculty, and spent the semester thinking about what is the good food movement, how is it taking shape in our region, how can UMD help it, and what impact should that good food movement have on UMD's food system. And through that relationship building, that building of social capital, trust, etc., we created this partnership. And as I said, we're growing food on this farm, working with students. And so the first year we grew about 7,000 pounds, which is a drop in the bucket. And then this year, it's probably about 20,000 pounds. I haven't added it up yet. But these are small, important steps in the sense that the university dining system is learning how to use and process themselves fresh local foods. We have also a sort of second shoe that is dropping. The Sustainable Egg Project's production was never about producing sufficient quantities of food to supply UMD. We couldn't. It's this kind of, it was conceived of as having a kind of a lever function, to sort of jumpstart. And so the second stage is working with the university as an anchor institution along with other anchor institutions in our region, including the College of St. Scholastica, the St. Luke's Hospital Systems in Essentia, and the DEC, the Duluth Entertainment Convention Center. And my colleague, Jamie Harvey, who's an amazing thinker and actor in food systems work nationally as well as regionally, is leading this project around a food hub, which brings together these anchor institutions on the one hand, and on the other hand, key area farmers, to ask each how we can create a supply chain between them. And UMD has participated in that, and just a couple weeks ago, St. Luke's committed to a 20% local purchase by 2020. And frankly, it's been very successful, but it's an incremental process. And, the transition from a kind of almost total industrial food system to one in which we produce maybe 50, 60, 70% locally is precisely that. It's a transition. It's going to take decades. And to expect this to happen in a couple years would not be fair to the complexity of integrating all of these sectors in order to build the capacity for us to realize this. And so, we are using our platform there to really help the university as well as these other anchor institutions along in getting them to acknowledge the giant role they play. Places like Duluth, eds and meds, educational and medical facilities play an outsized role because of the deindustrialization process has basically, removed manufacturing and industrial entities leaving these anchor institutions, these eds, meds, and nonprofits to be the main employers. And Duluth's economic engines have shifted from timber and iron ore and shipping to education and medicine and tourism. And so we need to leverage the current economic drivers, and they have a vested interest in this as well, because given the nature of their businesses, they're not going to take a great tax break and move to Beijing or Arizona. They're place-based, and they need to attract highly educated people. And particularly in medicine, these people can choose wherever they want to go. And so quality of life issues are really important to that so-called creative class, that wealthy class. And food is an increasingly important issue for them. And so being associated as a vanguard institution that's helping this kind of take shape, serving good food in their institutions, and helping the community move towards better health through local foods is all something these anchor institutions want to associate with. The trick is to create the pathways that allow their not so flexible systems to do that. And so that's kind of one of the projects we work on.
The big problem that I keep hearing about, or a big problem I keep hearing about with regard to these sorts of initiatives is just, well, it's kind of a two-sided problem. One is the unpredictability of nature.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't make, nature does not deliver 20,000 pounds of string beans when, the institution needs 20,000 pounds of string beans, even if it's string bean season. Mm-hmm. And if the institution insists that that's what it wants to serve,
right,
it's going to have to take the Cisco Systems truck to get it.
That's right.
The other problem is that the period of prime institutional need is not the growing season, it's the off season.
Right.
for educational institutions,
right,
and public schools and
that's right,
so forth. So I'm wondering kind of how you're addressing that issue, or what kind of thinking is going on in Duluth about how to get over that problem. I mean, if the big institutions rely on transport from Florida or someplace from, let's say, October through May, then it becomes a very big deal to gear up for local food May through October. What do you do about that?
Well, again, I think this is a transition, and it's cross-sector, and it's it's multi-decade. But you're right. Colleges and schools calendars are not are opposite the farming calendar by design. And so you have these challenges, and you can't fit a square peg in a round hole, which is to say you can't fit local food into a system that got redesigned for industrial food. So you have to work with the people inside the institution to help them understand the challenges of growing and food and the seasonality of the whole process, and that the menus need to reflect that, and it requires greater level of skill sets in their kitchen staff and their chefs and their cooks and all of that. And so one of the things that's happening at UMD is that we recently hired a new head of the dining services, Lino Cardozo, and he's great. And we're now in the process of hiring a new executive chef. And that executive chef's job will be to harmonize the menus with the desire to purchase locally. Because you're right, if you've got the same menu year round, there's really no way you can do local foods. But that year-round menu being the same is such a recent phenomenon and is only made possible by the integration of ecosystems around the world by an industrial food system who bases its existence on cheap available oil. And that too shall come to pass. We are entering a period of greater volatility in supply. It's going to be more expensive, and this sort of supermarket of the world effect of the industrialization system is going to ease off to the history bin, the dustbin of history. And what we need to do is, in a sense, re-embrace seasonality in our food systems and our dining services. And so, like I say, I feel very lucky to be at UMD doing this work because we have a self-operated dining system with people who are interested in solving these problems and partnering, collaborating on doing so. And as I say, it's about reinventing the system, which is happening at UMD. I want to say one other thing, though, about going back to our previous question about some of the work that I'm doing, if I may. Yeah. And so I spoke about the Sustainable Agriculture Project and just indicated briefly about some of the community-based work that I'm doing. But one of the kind of very large-scale problems that I'm in the early stages of hoping to address in some manner or another is the lack of infrastructure for education and research around food and agriculture systems in the Northeast. As I said, in 1912, the Northeast Experimental Station opened, and it became an incredibly important centerpiece of the developing local food system of Duluth, and was, important for many, many decades. And then when it closed in 1976, it was essentially that the university system, in particular the egg system, was abandoning a giant region of the state. And that had a huge impact on the food system there. And there's a certain distributive injustice about that, because the ways that the hatch funds are expended or created by Congress and doled out to agricultural experimental stations across the United States, including the St. Paul campus here, every other region in Minnesota is serviced by those hatch funds and by experimental stations except the Northeast. And so one of the challenges that I am seeking to figure out ways to meet is, how do we regain a proactive relationship with agricultural knowledge makers at the university? How do we invite resources back into our region? Because, I think they were right in the 70s to sort of say, look, you guys are marginal to an industrial food system. But in the present context, where we understand increasingly the relationship of food to agriculture on the one hand and food to human health on the other, we also see that the Northeast has some of the greatest health inequities in the state of Minnesota. And I don't know if there's a correlating relationship between that. There's certainly probably not a causal relationship to health inequities in Northeast Minnesota and the closing of the experiment station. But I am arguing that to fix it, we need the resources of the university system to rebuild our food systems. And it's quite simply not fair in this state to have a huge region bereft of the resources of this most democratic of ideals that was embedded in land-grant institutions originally in 1862. And so I'm working with farmers in the region to survey what kinds of needs they have, what kind of research questions do they have, and I'm working with local politicians to help them become educated about the inequitable distribution of resources around the state as it relates to agriculture, as well as working with people on the agriculture campus here in St. Paul to understand the process by which these decisions get made, to figure out a good way to reinstitute those resources that can help build a better food system in the Northeast and address those health inequities that exist there today.
So, if such a center were funded again, what are the questions that are emerging from your conversations with farmers as the research, the beginning research agenda of such a center?
Well, I think it's I would back up a little bit and before I got to answer that question and say that the original sort of research station idea and practice is probably not fitting to the present. Because implicit in those agricultural experiment station was a cookie cutter sort of model in which you essentially iterate a style of farming that then, gets transferred across the whole region. And you set up this demonstration farm that becomes the model, and then everybody is supposed to embrace that model. In our era of sustainable agriculture, of ecological knowledge as the basis for farming, cookie cutter models aren't very useful because production is site specific. It's about microclimates. It's about understanding particular soils. It's about working with natural systems in which are very diverse even in a small space. Even in 20 acres, there's multiple differences, meaningful differences. And sustainable agriculture desires, or not desires, but works with biodiversity and what they call specialized crops, and diverse cropping systems. And so that one place research center probably isn't the best model to the contemporary needs. And so what we probably need to do is create some kind of multi-sided mobile collaboration in which researchers work with farmers and say, what are your problems? What are you needing? What are you working on? And perhaps set up trials on different farms to iterate knowledge in particular microclimates and soil conditions that then can be generalized for others who face those same issues. But one site will not contain all those microclimates or soil conditions or whatever. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is, what are some research problems? Well, I think there's a lot of them. And, you know, the leg bone is connected to the thigh bone. Food systems are connected to the agriculture systems. And so what are we wanting here? Are we simply wanting agriculture, or are we thinking in a systems approach of the relationship between agriculture and food? I assume the latter. And so we need people to help, you know, build that infrastructure for local foods is one thing. But more getting back to agriculture, I think, you know, climate change is going to dramatically alter the growing conditions, and it already has, but it will continue. And there needs to be a lot of research on that. There needs to be a lot of research on varietal development of specialty crops for region-specific needs. There needs to be, you know, research around year-round production about really extending the growing season in renewable ways, in you know, working with renewable energy systems and so forth, and to what extent can you live on the annual energy budget of the earth to do these things, to produce food year-round or 10 months around. And then there simply needs to be a broad-based education about the role of food in individual and population health, as well as the maintenance of landscapes for ourselves and future generations. So the table is full of really important research questions, but there's not many resources at that table. And so we hope to present an evidence-based argument to the people who can make these decisions, to help them understand the kind of unjust history of the Northeast and the contemporary needs that we face, to reinvite the agricultural research system back.
I would bet that in the last 30, 40 years, a lot of farmers in your area, as a lot of other places, have been forced out of business.
Absolutely.
Now, in other places, like where you grew up, the way that happened was that things got bigger and bigger. Is that the way it's gone in your region?
No.
No. So what's happened, I mean, with the farmers that are still in business, given that they're competing with areas with very much more fertile soil, longer growing season, and the possibility of making use of really high-powered machinery, what have farmers come to? What have you seen farmers come to as ways of persisting in your region?
Right. Well, you know, when the university abandoned the Northeast, some community-based organizations began to take shape to, you know, continue the production of knowledge and practice around this. And, you know, one of the things that sort of came into existence was the Whole Foods Co-op, a wonderful anchor institution in our region that has been around since the late 70s and has really been a model citizen in terms of local foods and healthy foods and organic foods and so forth. In addition, you had the Duluth Community Garden Program that formed in '78 that continued to cultivate food skills and gardening skills in people. And then you had the Land Stewardship Project and its partnership in creating the Sustainable Farming Association that, again, stepped into this void that existed. And so the first thing I'd say is that community-based organizations stepped up to sort of plug the holes of the flood that was happening as this, or the vacuum, whatever, that happened when the university abandoned the Northeast. But of course, there was a lot of violent reorganization of agriculture through the 70s and 80s and 90s, in particular the 80s. And lots of small farmers or medium farmers went under for a whole variety of reasons. And so what you find in Northeast Minnesota, interestingly, are abandoned landscapes. Landscapes that had been cultivated at a point in the past, say from the teens through the 50s, that then were abandoned because of the cult of the consumer society and the flight of young people and the promise of industrial jobs. And the natural capital that supplied the industrialization process in the Northeast has been spent. They've extracted all that they can almost of the iron ore, and they've clear-cut the timber and, exhausted a lot of the taconite and so forth. And so a lot of those companies and corporations and sectors have abandoned the Northeast as well. And so you have these landscapes of abandonment there. At the same time that you have a vibrant, small farming community whose identity is very powerful and whose, in a sense, social capital is very strong. Because the social capital of the Northeast, I think, is quite remarkably robust. So the farmers, we don't have Big Ag. We don't have Monsanto. We don't have, Roundup Ready salesmen in our neck of the woods, because there's not that landscape for it. And that's, from my point of view, as I speak about sustainable agriculture, that's a positive thing because we don't have to negotiate the dance that somebody who wants to do this kind of work in western Minnesota, where I grew up, would have to do. Namely, the challenge by these continuing agriculture industrial systems, in relation to this emergent small-scale sustainable agriculture. But on the other hand, of course, it means we have less resources to do things. And so it's a mixed bag, and there are a number of very successful farmers who grow food, who raise livestock, and who supply a certain sector of society in the Northeast with really high-quality food. But, the reality is that it's really a class-based situation. If you have enough wealth and knowledge and information, chances are that you might be eating of that good food trough. You might be involved in a CSA. You might be purchasing, locally grown foods from various places. But it's that huge other sector that is in a increasingly stratified society that of poor people, of people with stagnant or falling wages that are left out of the good food system as it's kind of emerged. And so our challenge is, how do we extend the benefits of good food to more people? And to do that, I think, the local foods have to get into institutions like schools, colleges, hospitals, and in a sense, rebuild the food skill capacity of the community around not necessarily growing food, but being able to distinguish the health impacts of different kinds of food consumption and the ability to cook and so forth and so on. And these are challenges faced by regions all around the country, of course, but for us in the Northeast, as I say, I think rising out of the ashes of this history of abandonment that the Northeast has experienced is a pretty robust local foods culture. But as I say, it's limited to a certain strata of that society, stratum of that Northeast society that is wealthy enough and knowledgeable enough and has enough information to understand the ramifications of eating that food and can financially and otherwise access it.
So locally grown food is still more expensive than imported food?
Not necessarily. If I can just respond to that really briefly, one of the things that we've discovered is that in bringing together the producers and the anchor institutions and asking the anchor institutions to anonymously disclose their food purchases, what we've discovered is that organic farmers can actually grow food for some of these, for certain types of vegetables for institutions at the same price or cheaper than what the industrial system does. And so perhaps overall you're right, but there are a lot of low-hanging vegetables that could be identified to be grown and delivered to these anchor institutions that wouldn't change their financial obligation. But in terms of, meat and certain vegetables that are off-season and so forth, absolutely, the prices are quite, can be, 50% or even 100% more sometimes. Because, why? Because you're not having that grown by an undocumented worker, an underpaid peasant, or a sort of virtual slave. Instead, you're paying fair value for that food within a system that takes responsibility for the total production, namely what it does to landscapes, what it does to human health, and what it does to your body. And so our challenge really is to change the accounting system, I think, which is to say, to stop letting the industrial system off the hook for all of the expenses that it creates and externalizes to future generations or to cancer patients or to whomever, and internalize those costs in a full accounting system. And if we did that, local foods would be very, very competitive, if not cheaper.